I'm going to show you some simple steps to how to create the perfect pastry. To start with, we're going to use a chilled unsalted butter. We normally use unsalted butter so that we can control the amount of salt that we're adding. So we're going to add that in first. There's two real methods of making a short crust pastry. We either combine the butter and the icing sugar and bring it together until there's no lumps of butter, or we put the butter and flour together and then we add in the remaining ingredients once the butter has coated the flour and there's no lumps of butter. With this particular recipe, I'm going to add in the butter and the icing sugar, and I'm going to bring that to a smooth paste before we add any other ingredients. So make sure you sieve your icing sugar, and I'm using a pure icing sugar because if you have any lumps in there, it will be very difficult to eliminate in the pastry because there's not much moisture. When we're making pastry, we always just work on speed 1, no more than speed 3. We mix it initially to ensure that we remove all the lumps in the butter. If you have any lumps in the butter and we add other ingredients, it's almost impossible to eliminate those lumps. And when we bake pastry that may have small specks of butter in it, that butter will boil and it can leave holes in your pastry. So to avoid that happening, we're going to ensure that all the lumps are removed at this stage. You don't need to cream it or aerate it, we're just simply bringing it together as a paste. To check if you have any lumps of butter before you add the other ingredients, take a small piece of the pastry and I just press it between 2 spoons to ensure that I've eliminated any lumps of butter. So it needs just a tiny bit more. We've got some really small pieces of butter there that are not mixed through the icing sugar. Then I can start adding in the other ingredients. Next we're going to add in the egg. So the egg gives us a little bit of lift in the pastry, it adds flavour to the pastry, but it also surprisingly adds water, and what the water does is it makes the pastry less crumbly and a little bit easier to roll out. So I'm going to add that in. Next we're going to add in some ground almonds, or some people call it an almond meal. Now this is going to add some tenderness to the pastry so it's not quite as crunchy and a little bit easier to cut. Scrape the bowl down as needed to ensure that it all mixes through evenly. Next I'm going to add in some salt, which is going to enhance the flavour of our pastry. And I'm going to add in some baking powder. Now this is not used in all pastries. This is going to give us a little bit of a kick and a lift in the pastry, which keeps that beautiful crunchy texture but makes it much easier to cut. Next I'm going to add in some plain flour, or it can be called all-purpose flour. Once we add the flour, as soon as the pastry comes together, we stop mixing. If you continue to mix after you've added the flour, we start to develop what's called the gluten in the flour, and it can make the pastry quite elastic, which is what we want to avoid. We're not trying to create a pizza dough, we're trying to create something that breaks and has a really beautiful, short, crumbly texture. So adding all the flour in. Mixing it just on a low speed to ensure that we're not ending up wearing half of the flour, and we just simply bring it together as a dough before wrapping it and placing it in the fridge. That's come together now as a dough, so I'm going to show you how to wrap it to get a nice even pastry that's really easy to roll out. So I've got a sheet here of plastic wrap that I'm going to place the dough into. So take it all off the dough hook. We always work with the dough hook when we're creating pastry, not a whisk. And you can also make the pastry in a food processor, which makes it really easy as well. Or simply by hand. So now that we have the dough ready, if we make it into a really even flat square, it makes it very easy when we start rolling it out and ensures when we place it in the fridge that it's going to firm up evenly so we don't have some parts that are soft and some parts that are too hard. So just pressing flatly. If you need to use a little bit of flour, you can. Just to press it into a really even flat square. Now I'm happy with the thickness and consistency of that, so I'm going to wrap it up and place it in the fridge to enable the butter to harden, and then we're ready to roll it out. Sometimes that can take up to an hour or as little as 30 minutes. It depends how cold your butter is before you started. So that's a very simple technique of how to make your own short crust pastry.